one of the things I want to talk to you about today is not necessarily the kinds of things that we've been talking about so far today. I want to talk to you about something that a lot of people are spending a lot of time thinking about now, but not a whole lot of people are doing all that well. So how many of you actually monitor what's going on in social media about your brand or your industry? Looks like about 20–25%. And how many of you think that there is conversation about your brand and your industry? About the same number. So that's pretty interesting. So what I'll tell you is that a few years ago, you were all probably right. But now you're probably not. There's conversation going on everywhere. So there's constant conversation in social media. And chances are that your brand and your industry, even if it's what you consider to be some backwater B2B company, there's probably conversation out there about you. What are you doing about it? What are you thinking about? You look at all the different places people could be talking about you, and this is actually nothing new. So think about how this started, right? So we talk about social media, but message boards are considered social media. Now, I was on message boards in the early 80s, because I'm old. And so that was not only before social media, that was before the web. But now it's social media, right? So let's look at this one. So this is one of my favorites because at the bottom of it, it has kind of a bumper sticker style slogan, "Never buy from buy.com." I mean, any marketer would be proud to come up with something that pithy, right? This is great. But if this had been about your company, would you have spotted this? Would you have seen this kind of comment? Now, from the show of hands in the room, I think 75% of the answer is no. And then the question becomes, what happens when your customers come across that kind of comment? So what would you think if you came across this kind of comment when you were thinking about buying something from buy.com? And here's the thing, they didn't answer it. Now, when you don't answer, people think one of two things. One, it's true, and so that's why you didn't answer it. Two, you don't care. And sometimes they think both of those things. Now, you know that that might not be the case at all. It could be that they just didn't see it. But people hardly ever think that's the case. And the reason is because if they could find it, they think you could find it. Does that make sense? So if they came across it, they're not some kind of expert. They don't have any technology. They just like Googled it and there it was. So if they could find it, they think you could have found it. So it never occurs to them that you didn't see it. They assume you saw it. And here's what the responses were. There was like a long chain of things. It's like, same here, they're the worst, they stink on ice, I hate those guys. That's all it was. Post after post after post. And the response from buy.com, radio silence. Now, some people have said to me, well, how do you even know that this was a customer? This could have been, competitor who's just piling it on and trying to make you look bad. And the answer is that's true. It could absolutely be, right? On the internet, no one knows you're a dog. So could it be true that this, it absolutely could be true. So, but think about this. Suppose, let's take that pathologically worst case. Suppose it was your competitor. And you answer them, and you say, I'm so sorry to hear that happened to you. Can we give you your money back, or coupon for next purchase, or whatever your normal customer service policy is for this situation? And they say, no, too late. No, I hate you. No, not enough. I don't want. You know what's eventually going to happen if you hang in there and you're nice to them and they keep saying it's no good? Everyone else on the message board is going to tell them to shut up. And you say, what are you, some kind of wingnut? What do you want from these people? You want them to drive a truck to your house? What is it you're waiting for? They're being nice to you. They said they're sorry. They want to help you. And so, remember in school when they used to tell you to watch what you do because it becomes part of your permanent record? This is your new permanent record. It never goes away. This is from 2004. It's still out there. And the question is, what do people think when they see this? Do they see a trail of people that think you're terrible with no answer from you? Or do they see the conversation that I just described, where there's a couple of people out there that are just crazy, and no matter what you did, you couldn't satisfy them, and the rest of them are actually pretty nice people? And that's kind of what your choice is. Because your PR person may tell you, well, you know, don't dignify things like that with a comment, or you know, don't keep the story alive, or it's a one-day story, or don't give it fodder, you're giving it legs, all that kind of stuff that worked in a mainstream media day where the newspapers got thrown out every day. But it doesn't work anymore, because if you search for this, you'll still find it. And you don't want them to find it, right? At least not if you don't haven't answered it. And so then the question becomes, how do you do this? How do you keep up with that conversation out there? How would you find this? And the answer is you need to use technology for it. And it's not just message boards anymore, right? We all know this. So how many of you look for restaurant reviews before you pick a new restaurant? All right, so this is like asking how many people have arms, right? So what is it that's going on here, right? Now, it's not just that you're reading them and making purchase decisions. You're writing one while you're waiting for the check on your iPhone. And the longer it takes for the check to come, the fewer stars seem to show up. And so this is what we've gone to now. I mean, it used to be that the way to focus on this is if you had a crappy restaurant, what you did is you put up the pictures of the newspaper reviewers in the kitchen, and you made sure the whole wait staff knew who these people were, so you would figure out how to give them a decent meal when they came in. You'd get a good review, and you were set for another 6 months. Now there's a whole new strategy you have to employ. You actually have to have a good restaurant. Oh my God. This is a complete upending of our business model, right? And so this is what's going on, is that you cannot be in this position anymore where you think that you can just kind of game your way through life. It's not going to happen. So what's happening now is, you know, social media before it was social media was Web 2.0. Remember that? It's the same crap. Right? It's the same stuff. We just like to rename it so in case you knew what it was, now you feel dumb again and you need a consultant. So that's kind of how we operate. So what's going on here is that you used to be able to say whatever you wanted about yourself, and that was it. You said it, it was out there, it was done. Now you're defined by what everybody else says about you. And so, remember message control? How many marketers out there are old like me and remember message control? That's what we always used to talk about. You have to stay on message, control your image, all that kind of stuff. There was never any message control. There was media control. When you could put out the commercial or the ad in the trade magazine or whatever it is, it all costs money, and your customers were not going to spend that money. And so you had message control because as long as your competitors weren't talking about you and you were the only one talking, you could control everything. But does anybody think that there were no companies out there that had bad reputations? You know, that was the stuff that we were talking smack about back in 1982. I mean, there were, right? There were all these companies everybody hated. But the thing is, it wasn't in their face. It was me telling 2 other people. It was them telling 3 other people. Now it's me telling 3,000 people. And the company has to deal with it. That's the only thing that's really different. And so this is an explosion of data. I mean, you've probably seen all these kind of gee whiz statistics, and so I got my own. Every good consultant's got some, right? So here's mine. But my favorite one I didn't even put up there. I read this a couple of months ago. Every day, the amount of content uploaded to YouTube, so not viewed, uploaded, new video uploaded to YouTube, is the same as all of the content broadcast by the 3 American broadcast networks for the first 30 years of their existence. This is kind of a boatload of stuff. It's a lot of stuff there. So then the question is, what are you going to do about it? So if you want to operate in social media, there's really 4 steps you need to take. So you have to listen, you have to mobilize your company, because guess what? It's not your PR person who's going to do everything in social media. There's no blogging department, right? It's everybody in the company has to do something. You have to engage, which means once you've heard about this stuff, you have to actually talk to people, and God forbid, marketers have to actually listen and talk, and oh God, right? But yeah, that's what we got to do now, and you have to measure it. Just like all the other stuff that you do, you have to make sure that it's working, otherwise you're never going to invest in it. It's something that you can do while it's the flavor of the month, and as soon as some new shiny object comes along, then you'll be jumping on that, if you haven't measured it and you know what it's worth. So we're going to spend this time talking about listening. Right? So all these other things are important, but it's not what we're talking about today. So let me tell a couple of stories. So here's one that I especially like. So Scott Monty at Ford has been spending lots of time listening in social media, and one day he comes across something where a Ford fan site, I think it was for their trucks. So you know how there's these Camaro clubs, and some of these people who love cars, they put together websites of other fans, and they're always talking about cars and stuff. I don't really get these people, but it's okay. So they said, hey, Ford just sent us a cease and desist order. Isn't that terrible? And everybody was up in arms on the web. They're like, this is terrible, and people are tweeting about it, and they're updating their Facebook status and all this clever stuff that we do nowadays. And Scott Monty of Ford sees it. And the first thing he does is he says, that doesn't sound good. Now, think about this. What would your first reaction be? Would it have been, I got to figure out what this is, I got to get to the bottom of it, I got to investigate it and find out what's happening, because then when I know what's happening, then I can respond. That wasn't his first impulse. His first impulse was, that doesn't sound good. Now, that was, to me, the right impulse. That was the right thing to do. And here's why. Because as we said before, if it's out there, people think you've seen it. And so not answering means they're ignoring it. Worse, it might make people think it's true. And so the first thing he did is acknowledge, I hear you, doesn't sound good to me. That was an honest response. And that's part of what you need to do in social, is to be authentic, to be honest, to be a human being. Right? And so that's what he did. So he then gets to the bottom of it. It took him half a day to even find the right legal team in Ford. It's a big company. And he found them, and he found out that what really was happening was they sent this fan club a cease and desist order because they were making swag material with Ford's logo on it without paying Ford any money. So hats and all sorts of other junk. And so then Scott goes live with that and says, and everybody says, oh, all right, that makes sense. They shouldn't be stealing your logo. The story's over. Now, the reason that you want to do it this way is because once he said, that doesn't sound good, the story died down a little bit. And the story didn't become, and Ford won't even answer about it, and Ford doesn't care, and it didn't go there. Because here's what's important. Months and years later, all the things people said during that period of time are still out there. And the more of it there is, the harder it is for you to contain what people actually think. Because they can search for it, find this stuff a year later, and they don't necessarily find the resolution of it. They just find the original allegation. And so the more of it that's out there, the worse it is for you. The other thing that's true is, suppose somebody walked up to you, and suppose you worked at Ford, and somebody walked up to you at a party and said this to you. Would you have just said, I don't know what to say, I have to get to the bottom of this, let me see if I can disappear without talking to the person, and then when I find out, I'll come back and talk to her? That's not what you would do, right? You'd say, oh man, that doesn't sound good. You know, that sounds terrible. I'll try and figure out what that is, right? I'll get back to you. If somebody came to you with a customer complaint, You don't know the answer, but if they're standing right in front of you, you would talk to them. You should do the same thing in social media, as if they're standing right in front of you. Just answer. Tell them what you know and don't know. I mean, that's all that's required, is for you to act like a human being. If you think you can act like a human being, this is good. If you don't think you can act like a human being, social media is probably not the tactic for you. You probably need to look elsewhere. Banner ads might be good. Here's another one. So, Graco, baby stroller company. They were having a bad day. They had to recall their baby strollers for safety reasons. Right? So how would you like to be the PR person that day? This is not your favorite moment. So what happened was that all sorts of people were getting on Twitter and saying, I'm worried, I don't know whether my stroller's affected. So they had lots of people jump onto Twitter, and they didn't say to them, here's the number to call, or here's the website to go to type in your serial number. They said, what does your stroller look like? I'll tell you where the serial number is. Type it back to me in Twitter, and I'll tell you whether you're affected or not. And if you are, I'll tell you what to do. And it went on for days. And they're Conversion clients, so Conversion was actually helping them, from the company I work with, and helping them answer all this stuff, because you don't have to be a rocket scientist to do this, right? You just need to have enough people to be able to answer them. After the whole thing died down, there were as many newspaper stories praising them for the way they responded as were slamming them for having dangerous strollers. Now, that's a nice outcome for them, but think about this. Fast forward a few years, no one's going to be praising anyone for doing this. It's going to be what they expect. And the question is, would you have been able to do it? So here's another one I loved. Comcast had a very rude introduction to social media. They had a service person who was calling the home office trying to fix a problem that they couldn't fix, and they were on hold so long they fell asleep on the customer's couch. So in the old days, what would have happened is she would have had a story to tell a few people about how crappy Comcast service is. Now she took out her camera and started filming, posted it on YouTube with all commentary of, well, still asleep, still on hold. If they ever do answer the phone, he might sleep right through it, and they'll just hang up on him, we start over again. I mean, this is what it went to. And Comcast, they woke up, and I don't know if their service is fantastic now. I have no idea. But I'm sure it's better than it was, because what they do now is they have people on Twitter answering people's questions. And they were one of the first companies to do that. And because that is a way to help people, and it's a way to help people in public. See, it used to be that the cable company could get away with bad customer service because even though you were frustrated about it, they were doing it in private. So they privately frustrated you. Now they have to publicly frustrate you and let all the rest of their customers watch. And it's a little too much even for the cable companies to do. So here's an insurance company, USAA. What they're doing is they've decided social media is market research. So they have all sorts of feedback they get from their website, from surveys and focus groups, and social media. And it all goes to the same thing. And when they see everything pointing in the same direction, then they feel like they really know something. And sometimes what they do is they see things pop up in social media, and then they'll commission a focus group to see if it's really valid and to get to the whys behind it. Because social media can tell you what's happening, but they can't tell you why people feel that way. And so those kinds of things are happening at companies everywhere. So what does listening really do for you? There's a lot of things it can do for you. So if you think about how market research works, you can answer just about any question if you're willing to spend enough money on it. So if you want to do market research in social media, you can do the same thing. So here's a company that what they found out was that, and this was a bank, they found out that there was very little conversation before a decision was made to go with the bank for a certain service. So not much conversation there at all. Almost all of the conversation was after the purchase. But think about this. Who do you think is reading this conversation? It's all these people. Right? So they're reading about what your experience has been with the bank before they decide to purchase. And so rather than them focusing all their attention in social media on questions and other things that are pre-purchase behavior, they decided to focus everything on customer service because they thought that was really what was going to matter. And that's what listening can do for you. It can help you make better decisions. So how can you listen? So the first thing you can do is you can listen by person. So how many people are on Twitter and you follow people, right? Bunch of you, all right? So that's one way to listen, right? So you can pick people, listen to them. You can subscribe to to bloggers. There's all sorts of things you can do. You can also start to identify who the influencers are in the conversation. So if you know who's most influential, then what you can do is you can start to target them the same way in public relations, the same way that you've always targeted people to get your message out. And so you can put together elaborate graphs that tell you who's more influential than who. And so the person with the biggest clout score, like that person up in the right corner, they might not be very influential on this particular conversation. And so it's actually this person with a much smaller circle down here seems to influence everybody. So I call this the D-list approach, right? So not only is she the right person to influence, but she probably gets a lot fewer people asking her for influential things because she seems to be less influential generally, but she's really influential on the subject you care about. The other approach, which is the more common one, is to listen by topic. So listen based on what it is that people are talking about. What's the conversation? So you can put in Twitter hashtags. You can use engagement tools that let you put in very simple keywords. So Hootsuite or Seismic. TweetDeck was just bought by Twitter a few months ago. And so these kinds of tools let you type in a few words and then you start to do search. Mostly it's in Twitter, but some of them can bring in other stuff too. And so you can also use Google Alerts. Right now, Google Alerts is, so the first set of tools only looked at Twitter, basically. Google Alerts looks at almost everything but Twitter, right? Because Twitter doesn't let them at their data anymore since Google Plus came out. And so all of these things, you can put in these keywords and you can find things, and then the question becomes, how well does it work? So let's take 3 companies in the same business. So T-Mobile, if I type T-Mobile into this search, I'm going to do pretty well. Everything I get is going to be really about the company, and I'm not going to get anything that isn't about them. Right? It's going to be a really perfect data set. But suppose I type in Sprint. I'm probably going to get a lot of high school races, and that's probably not going to be that good. Right? So if I get all that data in there that isn't correct, what do I really care if it's 60% positive? Because it's the wrong data. Right? So that can be a problem. Verizon Wireless has a different problem. Most people don't tweet, Verizon Wireless sucks. Right? They'll say Verizon, they'll say VZW, and guess what happens? There's another company that's also called Verizon, not Verizon Wireless, separate company that's not the wireless company, it's the landline company. And so which company are they talking about? You don't know. And so that becomes an issue. So how do you figure this stuff out? So what you really want to do is to say the volume of our conversation has gone up compared to our competitors, right? More people are talking about us. That's really what you want to say. But the problem is you can't ensure the accuracy of the data set most of the time. So most of like the companies we just saw. And the other problem is that the volume's going up all the time anyway. So if you say, well, the volume went up 20% last month, it's like, well, maybe everybody's volume went up 20% last month. What does that tell you? Not a lot. The other problem is that if you want to just count volume, no technology sees everything. So they'll all see public stuff. So Twitter, YouTube, all the stuff that's out in public they can see. But Facebook, they don't see most of Facebook. They don't see most of LinkedIn because all that stuff is shared within your friend network. And so the technology can't get at that stuff. And things like ratings and reviews, it's public data in that you can see it, but the terms of service for the data say that it can't be scraped. So the listening services are actually not allowed to pull that data in. And the other problem you have in measuring volume is not all mentions are positive. Right? If people say you're terrible, then, and they might say it a lot if you're going through a bad stretch, but it doesn't mean that because your volume goes up, that's good. It's not true that all publicity is good publicity. And the other problem you have is that do you want to count just the records that they're in, or do you want to count every blessed mention? So if you have a blog post that mentions 3 times, does that count 1 or 3? You got to figure these things out and decide what it is you're really trying to do. What are you going to do with the data once you figure it out? So what metrics really matter? I would argue that one of the things that matter is a trend. If you can look and see your trend maybe plotted against your competitors, even though the data is inaccurate, the trend is much more likely to be accurate. The other thing I think you might want to look at is share of voice. So if you can line up all of your competitors, and you can see who's have a higher percentage and how that changes, that will account for the changes in volume of just being able to see more data coming in. The other thing you want to look at is sentiment, because you really do care whether people are talking about you positively or negatively. And so let's look at what the problems are with all of this data, not because you're going to run out and solve them, but because it helps you to understand what kind of tools you can use in different situations. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is what you're using listening for. What are you going to do with it? Right? Because there's no reason to just go out and listen. Right? Just as much as you don't decide, well, you know what? Let's commission some market research. I'm just in an inquisitive mood today. Right? I mean, usually you have some decision you're trying to make. And so you need to know what you're going to do with this stuff before you set out. And so there are many different things that you can do with social media listening. And I've just listed 6 of them up here. But the reason I listed these 6 is because these ones need aggregation of data. You need to look at a whole data set and really know that everything in that data set is relevant and accurate before you can draw big conclusions about the whole data set. Like market research is a great example. These ones, you can just look at individual postings and get somewhere. So no matter how inaccurate it is, if you get a stream of results and 2 of them make sense to you to go do something about, you can go do it. And you don't need to have this beautifully accurate data. It's critically important that you know which kind of listening you're trying to do, because the free tools do this just fine. They do a really bad job of the aggregation. And if you try to use them for the aggregation, you're really going to end up in trouble. It's like saying, I'm going to take SurveyMonkey, and as soon as I hit 1,000 responses, I'm just going to take those as the answer. And it's like, well, it doesn't make any sense because you don't know whether those 1,000 people are actually representative of your target market or not. You have to do a lot of work after SurveyMonkey to figure out how you really can draw conclusions. And that's what this is like too. The other problem you have is that sentiment analysis is actually fairly inaccurate. So it misses sarcasm. So in this one it says, oh, the iPhone is a beautiful girl, no doubt. But you can already tell that this is negative, just because you're a person. Computers think it's positive because it has the word beautiful in it. These 3 statements are all negative. So I waited online for my entire lunch hour at my Wells Fargo branch today. Negative, right? But what word in there would tell the computer it's negative? You know, it didn't end with, and therefore they suck, right? There was nothing that told them. And you'd say, well, maybe waited. You know, waiting's bad. Maybe waiting. But suppose I told you the tweet said, I waited online overnight for Lady Gaga tickets. Well, that doesn't sound negative, right? That seems maybe even positive. I might have had a great time, right? So the reason we know that it's negative is because we understand the context of waiting online at the bank. And so we know it's negative, but computers don't know those things. So there's other ones where you can point right at the word that tells you whether it's positive or negative. So you can say, hey, unpredictable, that's why that's positive or negative. But if I tell you it's an unpredictable movie, it's positive. If I tell you the restaurant has unpredictable food quality, not so good. Right? Same word, exact same word. So what's a poor computer to do? Right? They can't figure these things out. So here's what happens. You get about 70% accuracy on the relevance and about 70% accurate on the sentiment. And then you multiply those together and about half of it's actually true, which is, you know, less than most people are hoping for. So, I mean, kind of, if you tell people that the best algorithms are a coin flip, it doesn't excite them. And it pains me to say this because I'm the former distinguished engineer at IBM. I've been working for years in text analytics, and I would love to be able to tell you, hey, this stuff is great, it really, really works. It really, really works somewhat. And so then the question is, so what do we really do about that? So one of the things that you have to admit, even the most hard-bitten technologist has to admit, that you have to use human beings to correct this stuff. You cannot just go with whatever the computer spits out. So the machine is really good at collecting data, and it's pretty good. 70% accurate isn't terrible at making the right decision on relevance and on sentiment, but that other 30% can be really important depending on what you're doing. And so you need people who will go in and correct it. And so, but then you might say to yourself, hey, look, that seems very, very expensive, which to me shows you're paying attention. It would be very, very expensive. So what do we do instead? So instead, there's two techniques we can use. One is sampling. So instead of having to correct all of the data, maybe you just pick a sample and correct that. And then you extrapolate to the rest of the data. So that's a way that things are done in market research, and it can work. The other thing you can do that's even more promising is machine learning. So what is machine learning? So machine learning algorithms detect patterns. And so if what you've done is you've given the human analysts a whole pile of stuff, and they say these are all correct and these are wrong, then what it does is it looks at the ones that are correct and it looks at the ones that are wrong, and it tries to detect the patterns to see, well, what do they have in common? And then the next time around, it tries to take a better guess. So it could be that for the banking industry, every time you say waiting, it's negative. And that's what it was getting wrong. But for the concert business, when you say waiting, it doesn't seem to be negative. Maybe it's even positive. And so then they can start to look at multiple factors to make better guesses. But you need a lot of training data to make this work, and that can get expensive. So there's a couple of different ways that machine learning can work. One of them is called supervised learning. So what supervised learning is that every time the computer does something, a human being checks it. And so that's very, very expensive. You do that in the beginning to create the training data. Unsupervised learning is very cheap because there's no human being in the loop. But what it does is it can pull out things like anomalies. So something it's never seen before, it can pull that out and say, here's something interesting, and it might help you identify a story that is new. But the one in the middle is kind of the most interesting. It's called semi-supervised learning. And so what you do when you work on that is every time the computer takes a guess, for example, that something's positive or negative, it doesn't just say positive, negative. It says positive, and I'm actually 85% confident that I'm right based on prior history. And negative, but I'm only 62% sure that I'm right. And so what you can do with semi-supervised learning is you can kind of draw a line that says, look, if it's over 85%, just kind of go with what the computer says, but everything else we're going to want a human being to look at. And so that can save you an awful lot of money while still giving you really, really accurate data. Now, maybe the 75% of you out there still think this is the right strategy. And you can stick with that if you want to, but I want to make one more shot at you. I want to take one more try to say you really ought to think about doing social media listening. Now here's why I want to talk to you about this. Even if you're not interested in listening, even if you don't think there's any data out there, you don't really care, I want to tell you about a company that you may have heard of that absolutely is interested in this data and wants to listen to all sorts of things about you. Oh yeah. The big G. They're very interested in listening to all the stuff about you. And in fact, we've got evidence of two separate things that they're doing where they're listening. One of them is sentiment analysis on links. And the other is human ratings. And I want to talk to you about how they're doing this. So, a couple of years ago, there was this very embarrassing story in the New York Times about this nightmare of an entrepreneur who was actually pissing people off on purpose so that they would complain about him in social media so that he would get links, and that would actually raise his rankings. And from all indications, it actually was working for a while. And Google at the time had a very embarrassed blog post in which they were saying, oh, you know, this isn't good and we're working on it and blah, blah, blah. And they actually, in the blog post, said, a lot of people have suggested we use sentiment analysis, but we know it doesn't work. And they used the example that if they really use sentiment analysis to rank everything, then like most of the politicians wouldn't ever show up near the top of the list because everyone hates them. And this is a very spurious argument because just as I told you, you can decide whether the word weighting is positive or negative in a certain situation, you can also decide how much weight to put on your ranking factor for the sentiment analysis. So when people are searching for things about politicians, you might not put any weight on it, but when they're searching for things about where to buy something, you might put a lot of weight on it. And definitely Google knows the difference in those search intents. So that was actually Google just trying to throw up some dust so that people wouldn't be able to follow them. And there's a lot of evidence now that Google is actually paying attention to whether a link is a positive review of the site or a negative review. So there's a whole bunch of people that have done some work on this, and they believe that's happening. There have been patents that Google filed saying this is how you would do that. So there's some evidence that says they're doing that. But here's the bigger way that they're doing this stuff. They're actually using, you guys have heard of the Panda update, this little change that Google made about a year ago? You've heard of that, right? There was a couple of people who talked about it, and a few people who went out of business. And so what Panda is about is it's actually about human beings rating sites. So they have actually hired this cadre of people who are searching for things, clicking on them, going to the site, and giving a thumbs up, a thumbs down. And they're rating them on whether it's a nice design, whether the response time is good, all that kind of great stuff. And so the sites that get high ratings, they move up in the rankings, just as if they had more links or better social activity. It's another sign of quality. And the ones that get a thumbs down, they go in a southerly direction in the rankings. So this sounds interesting, right? But none of us really think that even Google, that has more money than God, can pay enough people to rate every search for every site multiple times so that they have a number of different rates. Right? I mean, that's not possible, right? Even for Google. Well, you're right about that. So guess what they use? Machine learning. How do they do that? Well, what they do is they actually analyze the subset of sites that they have ratings for. And then what they do is they try to identify who are the fraternal twins of those sites. Which sites seem to look like the ones they have ratings for? So if you constantly have title tags that go to 150 characters, if you have a ratio of text to pictures of X, if you have loads of ads on your site, if you seem to be using content that is repeated in 15 other places on the web, there's a zillion different factors that they could be looking at and trying to identify who looks like whom. But what they do is, if they think your site resembles a site they have low ratings for, you go down. If they think your site resembles sites they have high ratings for, you go up. And that's what they're doing. So what is the practical effect? So there's a bunch of sites out there that seem to have gotten hit. So content farms, screen scrapers, older content, at least for some kinds of search queries, have gotten hit. Now, if you search for when is Thomas Jefferson's birthday, or what is the name of Thomas Jefferson's home, I don't think that the age of the content is going to matter that much. It's pretty much stable, the answers to those questions. But if, on the other hand, you're searching for best digital camera, they're not going to show you a review from 18 months ago. And so it depends on the kinds of searches, but a lot of older content's gotten hit. Sites loaded with ads have gotten hit. A lot of vertical search sites have gotten hit. When you search for things now, you are less likely to see the number 4 result be from next tag. Because apparently the people who got those results didn't like them. And so those got rated lower. So what is coming in social media listening? So if we think about the things that are next, all the things I talked to you about is text. It's all text. Because that's really all we know how to do now. But you can guarantee that they're working on how to do other things. So they can already take the audio from a podcast or a YouTube video and after a fashion transcribe it. If any of you use Google Voice and you see kind of the things that you get as the transcribed messages, there's a lot of errors in them, but you can kind of read it and figure out some of them what they mean. They're going to get better and better at that. And once they're able to do that, that means that they are going to have transcriptions of all of the words that people speak on any of this media, and they'll be able to use that. There are some people that are actually looking to take images apart so that they could, for example, identify that this is a green tree on alone in a field on a sunny day. And maybe they'll even have some emotion in it that says it provides a feeling of peacefulness. And so there are people working on that problem right now. And as they're able to convert these things into words, they're then able to do all of the things that we talked about before that they can do for text. The other thing that is coming is, how many of you use Google Translate? All right, so if you've done all of the processing of the social media text, but it's in Italian and you're like every good American and cannot speak any other language, then what happens is that it can show you the relevant result, and it can use something like Google Translate, some other kind of machine translation capability that would allow you to at least get the gist of what the comment was about, even though you might not speak the language. And the other thing that's happening is predictive analysis. So there's already companies on Wall Street that are pouring loads of money into this, trying to predict stock prices based on sentiment for and against companies in social media. There have been a few amusing cases where Berkshire Hathaway stock went up every time an Anne Hathaway movie came out. This is actually true. I'm not making this up. Ooh, lots of talk about Hathaway. Oh, let's talk, you know, and that's what happens. So they're not good at this yet, but they've got a lot of money. They'll get good at it. But some of the interesting things for us are, what are the kinds of things that we would like to know? What would we like to predict? So would you like to be able to put a new product announcement out, see what the positive or negative response is to it, and then make a decision of whether you're going to go all in on manufacturing or just put out enough that you can handle a minimal demand, right? That could be a major decision that you're making based on social media predictive analytics. Would you like to take a guess at what sales will be for the next quarter based on how people are responding? Right? So all of these kinds of things are coming. Those are the kinds of things that all this kind of text analytics and machine learning technology is starting to make possible. So even if you're not interested in listening to this stuff, Google's interested, and your competitor might be interested, so that they know what the response is to your product, so that they're going to figure out whether they're going to double down on theirs. So I know I had a lot to say, but luckily I wrote it all down. So here we've got a couple of minutes left. Look, I'm Irish, so I was able to fill the room with sound for this entire time. But if you've got some questions for me, I would love to answer them. We also will be having a round table where I can talk in more depth about text analytics or to apply it to problems you might have. We had a couple of them already where we talked about subjects like search engine optimization, email marketing, all sorts of other things that you might be interested in, how you might be able to use these kinds of technologies to get an advantage. So are there any questions for me? All right, well, I'll be here through tomorrow. If you're interested in talking to me more during a roundtable, I'll be happy to do that. And just want to thank you for your time, and I hope you have a great time at the conference.